Welcome to the Smart Grid Maturity Model around the world. Depending on your location, we wish you a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening. My name is Kara Quinto, your moderator for this webinar, and I would like to thank you for attending. We want to make today as interactive as possible, so we have allotted time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. You can submit your questions to our event staff at any time during the presentation by using the questions widget on your control panel. Another two widgets I would like to point out are the Materials and Twitter widgets. The Material widget has PDF copies of all the slides, along with other work in the area of SGMM. Please also take a moment at the end of this event to fill out the survey located in the survey widget. Follow it for those of you using Twitter. Be sure to follow at SGMM Navigator and use the hashtag SGMM to join the discussion. There will also be polling questions popping up throughout the presentation. Now I would like to introduce our presenter, Jeffrey Ferris. Jeffrey is a managing consultant in IBM's Global Center for Competency for Energies and Utilities, specialized in business case and roadmap development. He develops and executes business strategies for a range of utility clients in North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. He offers depth with business case assessment, performance improvement, and large initiative planning across utility smart grid planning and development. Jeffrey, over to you.
Thank you, Kara. I'm very, very glad to be here today. The smart grid maturity model is something that has been a part of a lot of the work that I've done. I've been involved with maturity model assessments in Asia, Europe, as well as North America, also the Caribbean. And, it's taken many different forms in the work that we've done, but certainly an important part of the smart grid strategy work that I've been involved with, and certainly the work that IBM does with our clients, our utility clients, in regards to bringing some structure to planning and investments around smart grid. So very glad to be here. As a way of starting off, we've come to a polling question. I'd like to start off with a polling question to help me as we move forward and choose the right level and pace of our discussion today. So as you see, polling question number one, how familiar are you with the SGMM? And if you could come back to us right now with A, being on the side of the spectrum, not very familiar, to D, very familiar, that would be very helpful. And I'll go on and ask for results in just a minute. For our session today, on slide 5, we hope to be able to impart to you the value of a maturity model like this SGMM in relation to the planning and the work that's done around smart grid and the value of having a sort of common language or framework to share not only across utilities but across borders as we talk about the advancement of smart grid and planning for smart grid investments for utilities. Also discuss, we've got some material about the different kinds of participants that have taken the maturity model, talk about how the model applies both in the North American grid as well as Europe, and some of the characteristics of the companies or the utilities that have been involved with the maturity model and participated in responding to it. And finally, give you a view on how we use the material, the results from an individual utility, and how we leverage the larger community to build a benchmark comparison that can drive some of the planning conversations. Oh, and I should also point out that we'll touch on the role of navigators, which are the professionals that have been certified by the SEI to conduct smart grid maturity model assessments and talk about the role that they play in the process. So thanks very much for joining. So slide 6, this slide has been with us for as long as I've been doing the maturity model assessments, and it comes out of the last years where smart grid came on with a fury, a lot of discussion about smart grid, but not perhaps a lot of clarity as to what one person or one company or one jurisdiction regulatory entity meant by smart grid versus another. And utilities were faced with a challenge, and regulators for that matter, of how does smart grid apply to me, particularly with all the momentum the discussion around smart grid was getting. How does it apply to me, and how do I bring some business rigor to approaching smart grid? And so we found utilities asking us questions like, how do we understand what smart grid investments should come now versus later? How much of a risk is posed by the smart grid as some of these sort of leading edge smart grid technologies? How do we make sure that we're establish a planning process and a monitoring process that allows us to make sure that we're getting the right value out of our smart grid approach, and part of that would be understanding, what are other people doing around smart grid, both within a jurisdiction and across jurisdictions. And then really the smart grid maturity model came about as an effort to resolve some of those questions and issues. So moving on to slide 7, the smart grid maturity model.
Hi, Jeffrey. Just a second. We got those poll results in if you'd like to hear them.
Thank you, Kara.
The results were 42% of the audience is not at all familiar, 29% is somewhat familiar, 17% is very familiar, and 13% is familiar. Okay.
Well, thanks very much. I think that tells me I'll make sure that we cover the basics. But for those of you that do know about the model, my intention is to talk to you about some of the applications of the model that have been part of my experience. So thank you for that, Kara. So in slide 7, what is the smart grid maturity model? It's a management tool. So that's an important thought. It's really about at the senior decision-making level, applying and providing a common language and structure to the discussion around smart grid, so that the definition of smart grid is clear and the components of smart grid get agreement, and then wrapping a kind of a programmatic approach around the discussion around smart grid transformation. So the idea that there's the fact is a lot of the things that are done in utilities, when people aren't talking about smart grid, have smart grid implications, or in some broader definitions of smart grid could be considered smart grid investments. The idea is that this programmatic approach that sits behind the maturity model allows for a view that a utility can, or a jurisdiction for that matter, that's looking to guide investment around smart grid, a view that allows a prioritizing of the full range of investments that are smart grid related. And I'll talk to you more about that as we get further along, but I'll certainly say that one of the places that IBM worked was down in the Caribbean, at a nation that the Ministry of Energy had come to us about driving the maturity model as part of a broader nation 15-year roadmap. And we did a lot of work around the detail of the roadmap, but really that first engagement where the ministry really needed to bring stakeholders together, so that's the investor-owned utility, the regulator, as well as the ministry. The maturity model ended up being the discussion platform that got some of the initial thinking about where we are now and where we think we need to be in the future. So that's that management tool concept, working as a common language to really embody the discussion around smart grid transformation. On slide 8, I'll say I think the key point here is that the maturity model was developed as part of, or by utilities as part of a coalition that IBM formed in 2007-08 called the Global Intelligent Utility Network Coalition, where as I referred to the momentum around the smart grid conversation coming on, a lot of questions came back to us from our clients about the degree to which they were ready to take on the risks of new technologies and some of the implications of the new technologies. And in response to that, a select set of utilities that represented jurisdictions around the world came together, and that group was ultimately intended to share kind of lessons learned around smart grid planning and implementation. And part of that process was the utilities talking about how can we really compare what we're doing versus each other, and wouldn't a maturity model be a part of that? And ultimately, that was where this maturity model started. But it was very clear, I think, early on that there's a value to that common language, but it could go even farther with the right benchmarks in place or available benchmarks to help understand not only how an individual entity's maturity registers, but how that compares to others. And of course, an element of that is a much broader community around the maturity model. And so the model was passed on from the commercial ownership to a third party, a trusted third party that could take it forward as really sort of an industry standard around smart grid planning. And that was when it was transferred to the SEI, who have the Software Engineering Institute, who've taken it forward from that point. And on slide 9, just a moment on the Software Engineering Institute, a federally funded research organization within Carnegie Mellon University, and an established leader around managing best practices, tools, approaches, in a way that would be a natural for taking on the smart grid maturity model and really taking on the stewardship of that model and promoting it across the industry. And so on slide 10 actually gives you a bit of the view of what the SEI's role is around the maturity model. There's the governance element of it, so managing the inputs, one of the values of broadening the community base, which is up over 140 now of utilities that have conducted the model, taking feedback from each of those assessments, so governing the model and the evolution of the model, and then also promoting it into the industry. So we'll mention later, there are a number of partners that work with SEI around the model, but we very much appreciate the work that they do to broaden the awareness around the model, certainly through training sessions like this, and also or education sessions like this, and also training that they do around the navigators, the facilitators that are specially certified to move to bring the model to the highest value with our utility clients. So a bit about the maturity model. So on to 11, you see across the bottom the 8 domains. So the model is based on a logical grouping of smart grid characteristics that really represent not only the utility business, but also the value chain. So we'll talk more in detail about the domains themselves and how they relate to a utility. But suffice it to say, it's part of it is pretty obvious from the left, like maturity, the management and regulatory and organization structure, grid operations, utility management and operations. Moving to the right, you get to outside the utility customers and the society around the utility, and value chain integration looks to the entities that might be partners or third-party commercial customers to a utility in the sense of perhaps providing products to customers in a way that they leverage utility infrastructure, but really a separate entity in relation to the products and services they bring to market. So designed to be a holistic view across the supply chain. And then across each of those domains, each of those areas, a definition of maturity has been set. And from the early days, this has evolved to some degree, but ultimately, the idea is that there's a kind of a business as usual level 1, advancing to level 5, which would be industry leading, which in no way indicates that that's where everybody should be. And then the shades in between, I'll touch on in just another slide. Advancing once more, you get to see, I think, you just have to trust me that the small words there. I'll show you a bit more of what's in the maturity model in a few slides. But there are 175 characteristics that cut across those domains and the levels, and for each of those. When it comes to the maturity model assessment, there's a question that gauges the evidence of that characteristic being present, and we'll talk more about that also in a second. So moving on to slide 12 to give you a feeling of the levels of maturity in the model. I'll just quickly run through them. The level 1, as I mentioned, is really sort of status quo, so that's saying business as usual, without applying smart grid. Level 1, and the kinds of, across each of those 8 domains, the kinds of things that you see at level 1 are initial planning activities, so business case development. At level 2 is when you actually start, you've got business cases completed, maybe initial smart grid projects are being implemented. And so you might say level 2, you might have certain types of sensors or smart devices on your network. But it's not until level 3 that there's really integration work happening across smart grid projects. So maybe a smart meter project is implemented. At level 3 and 4 is where you get to the kinds of projects that are leveraging that smart meter data for maybe more than just a meter to cash. There might be work around using the smart meter sensor capabilities to input into your outage response process. And then ultimately 5 is when you've got utility that really is pushing the bounds, either for any number of reasons, but there's potentially a business driver that's really causing them to advance in relation to pushing the technology farther. On 13, I'll give you just a bit about the domains. So each of the domains, as I mentioned, is intended to drive conversations that relate to either the utility or how the utility relates to external parties such as customers or third-party service providers. And in relation to the questions or the characteristics you see in the model, around the upper left, the strategy management and regulatory area, there's a focus on understanding the degree to which smart grid is embedded in the management sort of planning process. So there, as you mature, there's you're being asked whether, or it's asking for demonstration of business cases that have been developed related to smart grid or governance that's related to smart grid. Organization and structure is the same thing, that that there's evidence as you move up through the maturity levels of some degree of structure or incentives or training specifically around driving smart grid advancement within enterprise. Cutting over to the right, technology again, things like the degree to which smart grid considerations are built into the IT architecture or standards are identified and implemented around the infrastructure that would relate to being able to leverage smart grid data across the utility. And then around coming down to customer here we're talking about the degree to which products and services, and these are new products and services and capabilities that a utility customer might value. So the degree to which a customer is given capability to participate, pricing options, additional new products and services, all those, the degree to which those are enabled or provided play a role in that domain and the maturity level. And then moving down to the left, grid operations. This is really about advanced operations, advanced monitoring and control, going in the distribution network. Taking a lot of the capability that exists today in the transmission network and make it available to improve the operations and control of the distribution network. So questions to the degree about those capabilities. Coming down, work and asset management, very much about using smart grid technologies to improve how assets are monitored and managed. Value chain integration, this is where you get into sort of extending beyond the border of utilities in respect to working with partners. So this is enabling other parts of the value chain, leveraging resources that could be used inside the market, such as demand and supply management, such that that could impact how the market operates. So sort of look outside the organization. And finally, societal and environmental, also looking outside the organization, thinking about what's the degree to which smart grid technologies are being applied, and planning is considering societal and environmental issues. So, you've got maturity questions in that area about the degree to which societal and environmental issues might fit within, might be part of the decision-making process beyond, say, network performance or business value or financial return. So I'll move to slide 14. So to give you a bit more of a tangible feeling for the model, these are examples of both the maturity model characteristics and the related questions. So clicking once, the first question you see here is question 2.1. Have you established an approach to track inventory and maintain event histories of assets? So this is directly aligned to a characteristic that is at level 2 in the maturity model that really is saying that there is a tracking and inventory process. So this question gets at the degree to which that characteristic is there. I'm going to press animation again so that you can see then a question that happens at level 3, which is the going beyond just as they're planning around event and asset histories to the degree to which assets, percentage of assets that actually have condition-based maintenance. So you see the progression of the questions, and as you would see across different domains, a similar kind of approach where level 1 and 2 you'll be discussing whether things are being piloted or business cases are in development. Level 2 and 3 is where you really get to demonstrate whether decisions have been made and implementations have occurred, and obviously in the course of the example of this question, seeing that evaluating the degree to which it's been rolled out across the network. Before I move on to the next slide, I'll say I mentioned the work we did down in the Caribbean, bringing stakeholders together. In another case, an investor-owned utility out in California, we used the maturity model. In fact, that client uses the maturity model regularly as part of their ongoing smart grid planning process. And for them, it was really an important tool for bringing the organization together, cross-line of business, to get operations and customer solutions all together, management talking about the role smart grid can play. And an example, here we've got asset management but of course there's implications from how you, in relation to how you use that data and the technology from the IT department that needs to be in place to support some of the leveraging of asset data across the enterprise. And what was I think a particular value to this client was that they were able to draw the representation from IT, the asset team, operations, and to start thinking about is this what we have? For example, what's on slide 14 is let's figure out what's the extent that we've got asset management currently, and to the degree that it makes sense to move forward and then start and to advance with some of these capabilities, and to the extent that it makes sense, how do we enable that, and what are some of the investments that we should be thinking about in the future? But so in that case, the maturity model, definitely a planning tool, but also very much a change management tool, and getting the organization to think about how the maturity model would, a smart grid would impact the organization. So moving on to slide 15, just a pause on what the SEI has put together around the maturity model. So in addition to a full description of the model, which would give you a view of the different characteristics that are available or described in the different levels and different domains, they've got this definition document that allows you to look deeply at that. Of course, there's the questionnaire itself, which is a PDF that we work with in the navigation process. The navigator works with the client or the client through what the questions for each of the levels are, and responds and saves that for scoring, and that goes back to SEI for scoring. The navigation process is something the SEI defined as part of their stewardship, and what comes back from SEI in relation to the as-is assessment that's completed feeds back into the navigation process. The navigator then can take some of his or her experience around the community of Smart Grid Maturity Model participants, as well as looking at the data that is of the 140-odd utilities, to start to bring out some kind of discussion points when it comes to the discussion of where a utility should be going in the future. The SEI's also got training, of course, and then finally manages the partner program, which we'll talk about in a moment. The bit more about the navigation process is on 16. It's a 5-phase process, and I think about it really around 2 crucial workshops. So the navigator conducts some pre-work, which is working with a sponsor at the utility to pull out some of the demographic information, context information, so that both recorded for the assessment, but also for the navigator's context as we get into the workshop, a sense of the nature of the utility's business drivers, and then there's this first workshop, which is the second phase, which is the process of working through the survey. So this is where we get representation from the client to really cover each of the domains. Each of the 8 domains should be represented by someone that potentially there's someone that covers multiple domains, but there's someone in the room that can speak to that domain. And the idea is that coming out of that meeting, you get a consensus view of this is where the client is right now in relation to the Smart Grid Maturity Model. And then those materials come back after being scored at SEI with some benchmark information attached related to the characteristics of the specific utility. And the navigator works to identify the questions that either put the client kind of on the low end of the peer group or on the extreme high end. Both potentially interesting conversations to have as you're in the 4th phase, the aspirations workshop, which is where you're working to understand or facilitate consensus on where the utility should go in the future in relation to, in 3 years, what maturity level should the utility be at in relation to, or the jurisdiction be at in relation to any one of the 8 domains. And looking at some of those questions that show the utility or the jurisdiction to be leading or lagging can be interesting discussions about whether that is an area to focus on, or perhaps there's been some overinvestment in an area that would deprioritize that area going forward. And then finally, wrap up. So you end up coming out of that process on with a documentation of not only where you are now but where you're going, and a bit more detail about what that looks like is just a couple slides away. 17, shows you what graphically this might look like in the sense that each domain will have an independent maturity. Certainly no reason that anyone the domains need to move together, and there may be business reasons that it doesn't make sense for as much maturity in one domain versus the other. And then moving on to slide 18, this is to give you a sense of really the rigor and detail behind the assessment. So what you saw on slide 17, the kind of straightforward documentation of the maturity. What you see on 18 is really some of the numbers behind the scoring, and probably worth highlighting sort of how it works. The strategy, management, and regulatory domain on the left, you can see that the client has achieved a level 2 maturity, and that's because over 70% of the characteristics at level 1 and 2 had been achieved. So given credit for being a level 2. Hadn't quite achieved that for level 3. Obviously close, though, at 0.65. 65% of the characteristics of that domain have been achieved, or there's compliance with 65% of the characteristics. I think what's interesting is flicking over to the right side of this chart on slide 18, where you see societal and environmental. There's in level 2, the client has actually got 76% of the characteristics of level 2 for societal and environmental. So things like triple bottom line, environmental considerations are built into investment decisions, that kind of thing. But there's something was missed on level 1, and they haven't quite hit 70% of the characteristics for level 1. You can see 0.68, and so what that is saying, and actually they would not be given, as you saw on the previous slide, credit for being level 1 or 2, and would be given credit for level 0, is that there's some fundamental capability that's not. It's obviously close, 0.68, but there's some fundamental characteristic that's not fully evident at level 1. That because the questions have been built sequentially, there's a feeling that there's a question about whether it's sustainable what they have in relation to level 2 without some of the characteristics being present at level 1. So we might have an interesting discussion, I think, about in this case about level 1 around societal and environmental. Are there some characteristics at level 1 that we think we might need to be able to achieve some of the benefits of being at level 2, and talk about what those are and what those implications might be. To give you a sense of how what the utilities see, what that comes back from the results or the assessment process. You see here on slide 19. For each of the domains in the peer group, there's a representation of the orange, the range, the orange bar showing the range for in that peer group around specific domains, and then the average for that domain against all respondents in that peer group, and then finally where the responding utility it lines up to the peer average and on the range. So again, a way to discuss where a utility stands, and are there questions about why your capabilities may be below or above particular average in a domain. A bit more on 21 to the aspiration settings. So this is I think a very powerful part of the process. Once you get an idea of where you stand, to really drive forward smart grid investment planning, you need to start thinking about where you're going if you're going to get there. And so what you see on 20 is that assessment that would come back from a navigator that's saying, you can see there some of the icons in the lower left, the blue plus indicating that in that question and for that characteristic, the utility is representing itself to be in the top 10 to 33% of the benchmark group, versus question or characteristic 2.4, where they're actually in the lower 33% of the benchmark group. So why? That's an interesting question about is that something we're comfortable with? Are we missing something in our smart grid sort of management and regulatory approach that other utilities are doing that could have some long-term consequences for us? So 20 is really setting up the conversation about where a utility wants to go and invest in 3, 4, 5, 10 years. And 21 is the next is the evolution of that and really driving the discussion. So we say you're currently at level 2, you want to get to level 3, comes out of our facilitated discussion where, this is the challenge of getting the different people in the room thinking about the same direction, and then documenting what's the rationale for moving forward, advancing in that particular domain, and then starting to think about what are some of the things that need to be done so that you can start thinking about how you might adjust your investment roadmap and that actions that need to be taken to meet level 3 maturity and what needs to be overcome to get there. So out of that discussion comes the beginnings of what some of the initiatives might need to be going forward. And then on 22, just to give you a sense, and this will wrap up this section. I'll ask for questions. Just to give you a sense of how this ends up looking. Slide 22, we saw how the as-is assessment is shown, and then you see how the target assessments relate to that. So the target aspirations relate to that. So in some cases, for example, organization structure, we've said we're happy with the client's happy with the capabilities that are present at level 3. And for this time horizon, maybe the next 3 years, there's no reason to adjust that. But there are some gaps that they'd like to close around grid operations going from level 2 to level 4. And some discussion, I'm sure, about what it's going to take to do that. But what I think is one of the key elements here, and you can see it in the blue box, is that there's no race to number 5 that happens in the maturity model. It really is intended to always keep the discussion leveled in the realization of business value, and to the extent that there's business value that suggests moving from level 2 to level 4 and work in asset management, I think that makes sense, and that those rationales are captured in the process. But it's certainly not the drive to get to level 4 just to increase maturity on the scale. So as I move to slide 23, I might just pause and see if any questions have come up to anyone in relation to that first section, which covered the what the maturity model is and really how it works.
Hi, Jeffrey. We did have a question from Bindu. It says, are CRM and revenue management assurance domains taken care of in the 8 domains? Yeah, so they would be in probably in a couple different places.
I think around some of the enterprise systems related to customers, those are covered by some of the characteristics, or they certainly would enable some of the characteristics around the customer domain. Revenue assurance, I think, also not only in the customer domain, but grid operations in relation to loss management. So the answer would be yes, and I think you'll see once, if you were to get into the detail of the characteristics, that some of them are tended to be fairly broad-based to make sure that we're pulling in those kinds of pieces. And I think there's in that question also a highlight of the value of having a navigator as someone there to facilitate the completion of the test, of the assessment, so that the considerations such as those are included in the responses to the survey questions.
Okay, we had one other question from Tracy. She asks, is our data protected?
Definitely. That is something that's come up with a number of the clients. I mean, it's a natural question. There are specific agreements that are part of completing the survey, and really what they limit they limit the SEI or anyone's use of the data. SEI is the steward of the model and the steward of the data. It limits any ability to individually reference a utility's data. It would have there's a benchmarking element that I've described, which means a consolidated view of all utilities and what kind of maturity ranges they have is part of the benchmarking process, but in no way does any respondent's data get associated with released individually or associated or named to a particular utility. No,
okay.
But I'll say IBM isn't even when I'm working with a client. When I'm working with a client, I see certainly their data, but when it comes down to it, IBM really has very limited access to the data itself. It's it's ultimately this third party trusted academic institution that's managing the data and protecting it.
And there's another question from Jillian. Do the reports still cover performance metrics as well as maturity scores, SAIFI, SAIDI, etc.?
Yeah, they do. As part of the you might call it demographic information that's collected around a maturity model assessment, there's things like the SAIFI and the SAIDI are captured. And so you can measure those, so those become interesting comparisons to certain maturity levels. So those are captured as part of the characteristics of the utility, not driving the maturity model process in so much as or beyond the fact that looking at a particular certainly reliability may be a key element to a utility's issues, and so as a result, that could drive a more robust discussion around grid operations or work and asset management in relation to how smart grid technologies might be applied at that.
Thanks, Jeffrey. That's all we have for right now.
Great. Well, thanks for those questions. So just moving then on to there's a series of sections, giving you for the fuller sense of the model and who's using it. So a bit around the different types of utilities that have participated and make up the community of respondents and responses that provide our benchmarks. Also, some of the participants or parties that work around the maturity model, so partners and navigators that facilitate maturity model sessions. And then finally, an aggregated view of what the results are across the entities that have taken the maturity model. So moving on to slide 24, I think you can see you've got a spread across the globe in relation to the 142 utilities that have completed an assessment. You can see that actually there are 157 assessments. That picks up that some utilities are doing it more than once, and so I have utility clients that use it as part of a iterative strategy development process. But I think you get a sense here of the maturity models application in the Americas and moving across to Asia and Australia. I'll move on to slide 25. This is a up-to-date list. I just saw this for the first time yesterday, or updated yesterday. So you see a list of the companies that have participated, and this is the extent to which companies are singled out. You get a sense of who's done it, but their data is never shared in any way that highlights who it's from. Moving forward, to give you a sense in slide 26, so the range of entities that have participated in the maturity model, both on the North American grid side as well as internationally, you see quite a range in relation to meter counts. And you can see on the left, you've got utilities operating in the 10 million meter area, and then all the way down to the kind of municipal side, skewing a little bit higher in size, meter count internationally. But you also see that range, and and part of the discussion that happens in the benchmarking process is looking at the other utilities that sit on the same in the same meter count area in terms of size. But no doubt, the utilities that are applying this are coming from all sizes. And I'll also give you a sense of kind of the characteristic of the utilities that are responding. You see on 27, the blue bars being the North American grid and the gold being international. The number of respondents that have identified these various characteristics in their operations. So in some cases it's an entity that's both transmission and distribution, or also generation and retail. And in that case, they would have checked all of the boxes. But you also have entities that I've worked with a transmission-only company that did an assessment, and you can imagine that's a little bit of a challenge, because customers for a transmission entity would be a different concept than a distribution or a retail entity, and you have to, as a navigator, sort of focus the conversation more on what the entity does to enable the end customer product or service, even if the customer is not directly associated with that entity. So, this clearly the maturity model, the way it's designed across the 8 domains, is intended to look across these different areas of operation. Moving on to slide 28, to give you a sense of the variety of companies here, we're highlighting the North American grid breakdown between urban and mixed, and then the international side similarly. Really giving you a sense that there's quite a variety in the kind of the characteristics of the company, of the utility footprints that participate in this kind of that participate in the maturity model assessment. So in the end, it's the utility that's got to decide, or the jurisdiction, the client, how far they want to go in relation to one of the domains and in setting aspirations. And that the part of that discussion is, if it's a very rural scenario, what are the costs in relation to rolling out a technology to that part of the network, and what are the benefits in relation to covering wide distances, and maybe a different discussion than an urban utility. And so, in the end, the characteristics of the utility guide the discussion in the room, but the model is used the same way. Moving on to slide 29, ownership structure. I think it's interesting to notice, but we've got, again, a fair bit of diversity in regards to who are the investor-owned utility or percentage of investor-owned utilities versus city and state at the North American and international level. I think we'll see in a slide here the numbers behind these charts. I think it's interesting to note that a lot of different utilities and ownership structures have participated in the model. Regulatory environment, again, showing fair bit of diversity. North American side between the regulated and the deregulated markets. International, a little less so, but part of it's a function of some of the entities that have come forward to participate. So I think you see, still a fair bit of diversity, and certainly, in my view, there's nothing in the model that would in and of itself be different for the regulated versus deregulated environment. Certainly, your ambitions around customer and the kind of capabilities you offer customers might be different if you were working in a regulated market with captured customers and potentially less competitive pressure between regulators. But that just sets different maturity model targets. The characteristics, I think, drive the same valuable planning discussion. I might pause there as I'm moving from 30 to 31, just because I've got a couple slides here that talk about the different partners and some of the elements that work around the maturity model, like the navigators. So, Kara, I guess let's throw it open to see if anybody has a comment or a question that they'd like to surface before we move on.
Okay, we do actually have some questions. So one of them is from Bindu. Any market operators and service providers participated in the SGMM exercise?
Market operators, and sorry, what was the other one?
And service providers.
Service providers. Well, I guess you would say yes. So the initial formulation of the SGMM came from IBM working with a select set of utilities, and so that those utilities had a view on what might be a progression in any of the domains around investments. IBM participated in facilitating that discussion. And now as we've gone forward and the community is broadly expanded, feedback is coming back all the time, and so the model has now been iterated, and that for clarity, and I think the kind of evolution of thinking about some of the incremental growth through the levels, or incremental capabilities through the maturity levels, and that is coming back from anyone who's participated in the model, and that certainly would include market operators, regulatory entities. As I mentioned, I worked with a Ministry of Energy in one country, and I'm sure the service providers. You'll see on this slide, actually 31, the variety of partners that are working with SEI in relation to the smart grid maturity model. And I'm sure as I feedback to SEI comments from my experience using the maturity model and sort of each new client case, I'm sure it's also coming back from a number of these partners.
Okay, we have another question from Ranjit. Is it possible to benchmark utilities based on geography?
It is. It's not terribly easy with the kind of initial benchmarking that you get from the SEI process.
Jeffrey?
Yes, go ahead.
It's Julia.
Hi, Julia.
I just wanted to jump in here and say, yes, the data is in a database now, and so we have for various navigations, we've done it by geography. We've done just municipals in Europe, for instance. So we do have that capability now.
That's great. Thank you, Julia.
We have another question from Greg. Does the report deliver a correlation from gap of maturity to IT technical capabilities required to be successful?
I think that that question, Greg, might be starting to move into the next level of planning that typically comes after the maturity model with the work that IBM has done. Often the maturity model is part of a larger smart grid strategy project. I'll say that there's part of the answer is yes, that there's a solid discussion in the technology domain around the capabilities that are required that are suggested at certain maturity levels. But in relation to correlating across to different domains and understanding what technology investments need to be in place to assist advancement in other domains, that I think comes primarily through this sort of next level of discussion when you start really thinking about what the initiatives might need to be to advance certain to meet certain business needs or achieve certain business value, and start thinking what the implications are, say in the operating technology space versus the IT space. And so I guess it's a way of saying that I think the maturity model gets you to the conversation I think your question is implying, but very quickly gets you into the discussion of what's next in the next level of planning.
Thanks, Jeffrey. That's all for right now.
All right. Thanks for the question, guys. So then, let's see. I'm on 31. We've talked about the different partners. So each of these organizations is a partner with SEI. Has got professionals that have been certified by SEI to be part of the navigation process and be the facilitator. We can talk more about that on the next slide. You can actually see that on slide 32 for a view of where the navigators sit around the world. These navigators have that kind of double role. There's an option to take the maturity model assessment on a utility or client's own, meaning that they work through the assessment and then submit the results and to SEI. The navigator process, which I highlighted earlier, that 5-phase process, adds the element of a navigator or someone in the room that's got deep experience with the maturity model to help the definition of questions, to get kind of a common understanding of what the question is getting at, taking out that uncertainty about whether the question is being answered correctly. And then also that the key part of the second workshop, the aspiration workshop, which is driving the group and testing ideas around where a utility should go in the future in relation to what level of capability or maturity ought to be set as a target. So, I think an important extension of what's inside the model is the facilitation part. Excuse me. What's interesting, I think, on 33 show you the growth around the maturity model assessment. Early on in 08, I think you're really seeing there, that initial group of utilities that were part of, drafting the first instance of the maturity model. But you can see, significant growth, both in North American grid as well as international in regards to accumulating scores to the community to feed into the benchmarking that we do for each new client and for each new assessment. Wanted to stop on the next slide and hit our second polling question. What do you think is the most frequent motivation for utilities to conduct a smart grid maturity model navigation. A, expanding access to electric power. B, enabling new business opportunities. C, regulatory compliance. And D, improving reliability. So appreciate you taking a minute to respond to that. That'd be interesting to have you think about that. As part of each maturity model survey, we collect that kind of information. We ask them to prioritize the drivers related to moving forward with their smart grid program, and so 35 shows a bit of that. Kara, have you started to see any responses to that question?
Yes, it looks like 43% answered improving reliability, 36% answered enabling new business opportunities, 14% answered regulatory compliance, and 7% answered expanding access to electric power.
Interesting. I know probably all of those responses are grounded in the market that you come from. Certainly, it's reliability is a issue in certain jurisdictions, but then you go to a place like Japan where SAIDI is mentioned and is measured in a minute versus multiple hours. Reliability and the priority around reliability is different meaning, and I think that just goes to show the variety of business needs and business priorities that are on the utility side, which guide the responses to the maturity model. But effectively, the maturity model is designed to operate in all of those sorts of market contexts. On 35, you actually see the priority. We ask the question such that recall they select what's the highest priority, what's the next, and they mark that one 3. What's the next highest 2, and then next highest 1. And so you can see, actually, it's electrification. Expanding access to power is one of the top motivations from utilities, both in North America and international. Environmental also plays a very big part over on the left. And it's interesting when you come across to the right, improving reliability. Big, particularly, standing out that a bit of a higher score in the international context, which depends on the respondent and the circumstances of their network. But potentially that there's some areas outside of the U.S. that or North America that require bigger focuses on reliability. One of the things I think looking at this chart, I think it's interesting to watch the priority on the left. The reality is though all of these I've made the list, so all play a role in. And of course, some of them are interrelated, play a role in what's driving the smart grid discussion, and ultimately the activities like the smart grid maturity model. Getting into the results section, we thought this might be interesting for you. Just get a sense of what the community as a whole looks like in relation to their maturities. So 36 showing you this strategy management and regulatory on the left, across to societal and environmental on the right for North America, and then again for international. And so you can see the range, and quite a dramatic range, isn't it? And I think that's to say that people are coming at this from a variety of different business contexts. In some cases, they've conducted the model more than once, and that's I think I've seen have a tendency to drive up scores as well as drive down scores for a couple different reasons. But, when they've done it again, that could mean that they've had now 2 years to invest in focused work around the smart grid characteristics, and that would drive up their score. In other cases, the more you know, sometimes the more you realize you don't know, and start to be more conservative the second time around. But you can see that the average, across is really, besides that large range, the average is really about 1. And so I think that's to, say that, this is still a emerging area, and certainly there's no reason that a utility or a client completing a maturity model needs to be thinking about how they can get as high as possible. In fact, that's counterproductive, I think, to the planning discussion that needs to happen. That leads into hopefully the programmatic approach to investments. Moving on to 37, this picks up a bit on that point I was just mentioning in regards to utilities that have taken the maturity model more than once. So I think if you recall, there are a handful of utilities that have maybe 10, 15 that have done the maturity model more than once. And looking at sort of what happens between those assessments, I think the key point is, the clients that I've worked with that have done it more than once are really using it as part of an iterative, the maturity model is part of an iterative planning exercise. And it looks like SEI is saying that the average time is 31 months between submissions. I know for one client, when they were responding to the regulator in regards to their smart grid deployment plan, they made a lot about using the smart grid maturity model as part of a backbone of their strategy iteration process, because they thought it was important for their ability to communicate with the regulator on what they think they need to achieve and why, and talk about and be able to measure progress against that, and for them coming back and doing the maturity model again made sense. So you can see, I think it looks like to me on 38, a lot less. I guess in a couple of cases, grid operations and work asset management. I'm suspecting it looks like not as many utilities have taken the exam twice, but it certainly with some of the work I did in Asia, it's very much about how they can use the utility to manage stakeholder conversations and measure progress. And one of the things I think that's kind of interesting as a quick aside to that work that I've done around the globe is the maturity model discussion ends up having kind of different priorities around it. In one case in Asia, there was really quite a motivation to move forward with the utility smart grid plan, and in fact we set aside some time besides the typical 5 phases of a Navigator approach that we talked about earlier. Set aside some time to after the aspirations are set to identify what 2 or 3 of the key initiatives might be to advance maturity as we've sketched out in the aspirations session or the target setting session, and then put some time aside to some breakout groups to help flesh out what those initiatives were like, and so helping get the conversation to sort of the next level of planning. And totally different scenario also in Asia. The client was I think actually quite robust around their smart grid investment plan and roadmap, but struggling with what their kind of opportunities were, sort of new business opportunities around customers. And so we had sort of an envisioning session around new products to complement the aspirations that we set out in the maturity model, the sort of scope of the traditional maturity model session. So Yeah, different ways you can kind of wrap additional activities around the maturity model, and of course related to the nature of the utility and the business drivers and priorities of the utility. So let's see, moving to 39, some concluding thoughts. The smart grid maturity model has been used globally and can move between utility clients of all characteristics and geographies. It's been, as we showed, used at different sizes, different regulatory environments. Also clearly globally and in North America. And as we pointed out, the benchmarking can be targeted for different discussions based on geography. And then I think want to come back around as a conclusion that I certainly feel that the maturity models has offered value to the clients that I've brought it to, and that sometimes that's initial sales conversations where we're working with a client to sort of understand sort of how we might bring the wider organization into the smart grid discussion, or part of 2 to 3 month smart grid strategy assessment. The maturity model allows a utility or a customer to client to drive a smart grid discussion across the utility, across lines of business, and that really means a lot when it's about trying to build some consensus about the impacts of smart grid and some of the investments that need to be made to realize the benefits of smart grid. And then I think also on this point the role that for utilities the smart grid maturity model has around helping take a kind of value chain wide, utility wide approach in relation to investment planning. And very very quickly you start to realize in these discussions, well, we're already doing a lot of these smart grid projects that could be considered smart grid projects, but they really haven't been tagged as smart grid. And if we're going to sort of think about sort of what we want to overall business value we want to achieve, how does that relate to the other investments that might need to be, that could be made to achieve, address a business priority, and that programmatic approach allows you to start to, kind of look at the portfolio investments and potentially dial some back if you realize that there's some other investments that are priorities that, without this comprehensive look, it might just be going boldly forward within one part of the organization without consideration of other investments that are being done elsewhere in the organization, and certainly, the coordination across those investments in ways that, the technology team might be looking at how they can get additional streams of value or benefit out of new sensors or new assets on the network that have additional capabilities that without the technology team working on some of the integration work, there might not be anything to take advantage of that additional capability that the asset was providing in relation to new asset information or new network information. And then finally, on the concluding thoughts around the role of the navigator. As I mentioned, there's an avenue for a customer or client to take the maturity model on their own, but there's a opportunity for the navigator to be part of the process, a navigator to be part of the process from one of the partner organizations that were mentioned previously, and that allows for a kind of consistent accuracy of data in relation to how questions are interpreted and how various answers what various answers mean. So important to that kind of consistent accuracy of data, and also participating, I think, importantly in the analyzing of the responses, which is a big part of setting up that aspiration setting, or setting up the aspiration workshop and the targeting of capabilities to really understand sort of that benchmark comparison. And then and I think finally that the value that sometimes an outside facilitator brings around being able to bring consensus to the hard conversation about where the priority needs to be. Is it grid operations? Is it work in asset management? If it's both, where else can you say you're going to get resources for your planning of the next 3 years? So so those are some of the concluding thoughts. I think then why don't we take it to slide 40 and open it up to questions. Kara?
Yes, we have a question from Vanessa. Is there some research results on ROI for moving up in the domain?
There is. There's a tool that IBM developed, a quantification tool that's aligned to the maturity models, and we built it based on studies that were done around pilots, and to the extent that the implementations of realized value. We pulled in these benchmarks into this quantification tool that it starts by pulling in characteristics of the particular utility, and then looking at the as-is maturity level and the to-be maturity level, and what the return might be around moving from as-is to to-be. Part of the tools is bringing in some of the experience that you have that a provider might have around implementations, true costs on what the implementations might be. So anyway, the tools like that, I suspect maybe perhaps the other partners that work with SEI have something similar, but IBM identified the need for something like that, and I've got a tool that we bring into the discussion to help with that kind of balancing of resources and value delivered by the maturity discussion.
The next question is, does the model... Oh, I'm sorry. The next question is, how many consulting companies or experts are using this model?
For a long time I thought it was 3, and then if you look on slide 31, you can see that number has increased significantly. So really, what you see on 31 is that set of service providers that have certified navigators within them.
Okay. Does this model help to define the projects that have to be implemented to increase the levels in the domains?
Yeah, I would say yes, but that really is. I'm sorry about that. I got some static on my end. Kara, can you still hear me?
Yes, you're still there.
Oh, great. That question is really getting to really what happens next after the model. But certainly it is, the model is helping define what those initiatives might look like. We talked about in the aspirations process, there's the sort of identification of the rationales and the obstacles to moving from one maturity level to the next. High-level discussion about what needs to be achieved with an organization. The next level of discussion is really when you get to what are the initiatives that need to be in place, and you start. When we approach smart grid strategy and roadmap efforts, I mean that's a kind of an iterative process. You get kind of a first list of initiatives in place and do some general sequencing based on dependencies and business priorities, and then. Then you take, if you think you've got that about right, you take the next level and really start to build out a 1 to 2 page kind of definition of what the initiative is, and the business value assessment, business case that goes along with it, to really get to sort of the go, no-go kinds of decisions around initiatives. So, long way of saying the maturity model starts the initiative kind of planning process, but in our view, that's there's a fair bit to do after that, which is part of the standard initiative planning process.
Okay, we have a question from Bindu. Electricity business is changing from the conventional supply chain to a peer-level ecosystem. How relevant are SGMM exercise at utility level in this scenario? There's a second part to the question. Should it be done at sector level for a particular geography?
Okay, interesting question. So you bring up an important point, and I'd say the smart grid maturity model is definitely designed to include that ecosystem idea in the discussion, and there are a couple domains that do that. One of course is the value chain integration domain, and it really is about understanding that going forward in certain geographies, depending on the drivers, but also just where smart grid is enabling new providers to participate in markets. There is a lot of momentum around third-party providers participating in the ecosystem, and that domain, the value chain integration domain, is really about to the degree to which the utility or the jurisdiction is enabling that kind of ecosystem relationship. There are questions in that domain about the degree to which security and privacy are considered as part of the planning process, so that security in relation to data transferred outside the utility across to one of these service providers, and other questions about enabling service providers. So definitely part of the smart grid maturity model. And then to your second point, let me see. You were asking about whether we could go to a regional, apply the maturity model at a regional level, and I have done that in one case. I know it's been done in several, where it was done at the country level for a country in Latin America, and I did it at the sort of individual company level, and then at the country level in the Middle East. And I think that's. But I guess I also did it in the Caribbean, but that was basically one nation, one utility. But it definitely an important. It can be an important discussion when the utility is thinking about, the jurisdiction, the ministry, the regulators is thinking about sort of how to advance the marketplace within a jurisdiction, and thinking about what kind of capabilities need to be in place that might inform, in direct involvement with some of the participating utilities within the jurisdiction or sector. So, I think it can be a valuable tool at the kind of regulatory ministry planning level, as well as at the sort of utility business level.
Okay, and the last question in our queue at the moment is from Sanjeev, and it is, what happens after the navigation?
Okay. So similar to, I guess I was sketching this out to some degree. I mean, this is the process of taking the aspirations that are set in Phase 4 of the navigated approach, and decomposing those into initiatives, and that's something that takes that we've experienced requires perhaps a team of consultants, 3 to 4 consultants, 2 to 3 consultants, or internally. But basically, it's that process of really articulating what the initiatives are to advance. If management's agreed that there's some target set in relation to maturity of the next 3 years, what are the initiatives to get there? And I think sometimes the doing it with external support makes some sense, because Often you're dealing with some projects that are in flight, and there's some difficult discussions that need to happen about whether do the projects that are in flight align to the priorities that were set in the maturity model process. That was part of this holistic approach that forced the team to make trade-offs across domains, and sometimes those can be difficult conversations to have internally. But certainly that sets up the detailed planning around each of the initiatives, and ultimately getting to the initiative descriptions that would guide the assignment of resources and the funding requests, and ultimately benefit targets that would be tracked in relation to implementing the project.
Okay, that's all the questions that we have. Thank you, Jeffrey, and thanks to everyone who joined us for today's presentation. If you're interested in becoming a certified SGMM Navigator, the next course offering will be June 4th through the 6th. Also, I just want to remind everyone that slides and recordings will be available after the event. Please take a final moment to fill out our survey in the survey widget, and we hope you have enjoyed this event.
Thank you, everyone.